Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned.
Welcome to Shaken Not Burned. I am your host, Giulia Bottaro. Working in sustainability means getting the story right. We may have crunched the numbers, figured out the risks of a biodiversity loss in a certain area, or the opportunities arising from decarbonizing the sector we operate in. But if we don't communicate effectively with our stakeholders, there is a real risk that all of this effort will go to waste. This is particularly true when communication with stakeholders requires navigating cultural differences. So how can storytelling help enable a just transition? We discuss today with Somia Sadiq, founder and CEO of Narratives and Kahanee. She also very recently published a novel called Gajarah. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, can you tell me a bit about your professional journey, the companies you founded, and also the book that just came out?
I founded the company Narratives about 8 years ago. I chose the name Narratives because the word storytelling was taken. So I thought, how do I still find a way to really get at the heart of what I envision Narratives to be? So Narratives is a planning and design firm. We work with nations, organizations, communities across Canada to find creative ways to do planning, community planning and design. And then I founded Kahanee, a non-for-profit organization, just a couple of years ago. Kahanee, the word Kahanee in Urdu, Punjabi, and Hindi means story. And Kahanee's mission is to bring different people together in storytelling through art, through music, through performance, through poetry to build peace. And Kahanee has initiatives around the world that we're tapped into and supporting. And then lastly, Gajarah is my debut novel. I very strongly believe in the power of stories and the power of fiction as a mechanism for healing and the power of intergenerational memory. And that is what Gajarah is about.
How did you get here to make storytelling your job, essentially?
Mothers read stories to their children during, time to go to bed, and you read them a story. Or your grandparents tell you stories of what days used to be like when they were growing up and when they were kids. Your aunties tell you all sorts of stories. And this is how we learn a lot of things. We have storybooks at school. We have stories that are shared in family gatherings and community gatherings. And even in workplaces, we relate to each other's life through stories. Yet somehow when we get into conversations around sustainability, around, growing effectively, around economic development, we somehow forget that stories play such a powerful part in our lives and can be leveraged. So I wanted to find a way to bring my own way of growing up and learning, which is through stories, into the work that I do.
Can you provide some examples?
Absolutely. One of the initiatives, for example, at Narratives, when we're working with communities to undertake a climate risk assessment. So we're increasingly seeing the frequency of extreme weather events going up substantially around the world. In Canada, particularly in the province that I'm working in, we have seen a significant surge in wildfires. Now, when we're working with Indigenous communities, First Nation, Métis, Inuit communities, they're often facing the impacts of climate change so much more than some of the other communities might be facing. In order for us to understand what really is changing in the environment, we can take your typical approach of, talking to a few scientists and understanding the scientific perspective. But that alone is not enough. Like data and policy and maps can only go a certain distance. What makes for a really powerful conversation, especially if our goal is change, is to talk to communities. And one of the most effective ways to bring communities into the process and respectful in truly ways that honor their way of being is to engage them in story. What was it like when you were growing up? What was different? Where were the moose when you used to go moose hunting with your grandfather? What does it look like today? So bringing all of those perspectives in really allows you to center any outcomes in community, because ultimately we can negotiate all sorts of agreements, but unless the communities feel like they're a part of the change, sustainability is not going to go too far.
I think all of us can relate to that extent in terms of climate change. All of us have a story of, I remember when I was a kid and it used to snow more, for example, or the summers were less fierce. And I find when I talk to people that are not convinced, I will say, about climate change, I'm like, well, 15 years ago, it was less warm in the summer, so that should be enough. So yes, bringing the individual in the story is quite powerful.
And it also makes it more accessible for people, right? Like your example is a great one, Giulia, because people may not be able to comment on by how many degrees is the temperature changed, but they could say, you know what? Yeah, you're right. It used to be cooler in winters, or it used to be a little bit warmer in winter
Yeah.
months. And that makes those conversations so much more accessible for everyone beyond just climate scientists, for example.
Especially when you talk about, for the Paris Agreement, we talk about 1.5 or 2. And, to the average person, it doesn't sound like a lot. Because if today is 1.5 warmer than yesterday, it's not going to change my day much. So bringing that macro number into something more micro, I suppose, helps. So how, in all of this, how can businesses take part of this conversation? Do you work with businesses? Do you work with communities? Like, how do you embed everyone in the same type of work?
Yeah, for any of the initiatives that Narratives is involved in, they're very community rooted initiatives, they're community led initiatives. And we have councils of elders who advise on how a project needs to unfold. We also incorporate very deliberately a strong storytelling aspect to the conversation. So, this earlier example of doing a climate risk assessment or even building a climate adaptation strategy for a community, we would first anchor the conversation in story. And it's not just a few of us technicians, if you will, having the conversations with a few community members. We'll incorporate videography elements, we'll incorporate like podcast elements, so that the community members are not only sharing their stories, but are also have a tangible asset that they can reflect on and remember the time we shared the stories about. And we incorporate youth in those conversations, so they get to be a part of the conversation as well. So by doing that, our final product then is not just a technical report. Business, we have many conversations internally about what does climate anxiety look like? What does change look like? Because when we're working with different organizations, it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like we're doing so much and yet nothing is changing, which can feel very heavy. So having conversations about little change internally also goes a long way to help keep boosting the work.
It sounds really smart to create the podcasts and videos as well, because the people who have been part of it have been interviewed. Then they will share it on social media or with the people that they know, because I'm imagining they're proud of having contributed to something like that. So it's a really nice way to involve people.
Absolutely. And we've seen, like, on one of the initiatives that we were involved in, the local school in the community, the teachers brought their students in and the students got to be a part of this and they got to tell their stories. And the students got to share those stories with their families, with their grandparents. Like, it was a big celebration of what everybody was doing. So all of a sudden, this little, what might be boring homework at school related to sustainability turned into this like, ooh, look.
Yeah, I'm famous. That's really interesting because, as well, if you are being interviewed for something, you need to really think about what you'll say. So it's also an opportunity to articulate what you might be just feeling, just put words to paper. And I think it's also part of storytelling is, the process of I have a feeling, which may be climate anxiety, unease, but I want to say something constructive maybe, or optimistic. I don't know.
Absolutely. And the other thing it does by incorporating different ways of expression, and this is something I touch on in my novel Gajarah, which is a combination of poetry and prose. And it's a very sensory immersion for a reader, a very sensory immersion in the characters' lives. What's really has been noteworthy for me through the course of my work in sustainability, in peace negotiations, is when you bring different forms of expression together is where the real magic is. That's where real transformation is. So it's not just in a report or not just a video, but it's really holding space for people to express their concerns, their thoughts, their excitements, their feelings, as you said, in many ways of expression. So be it through art, we've also had initiatives where community members get to create something on a piece of canvas, or they get to leave notes on it. So really finding ways to be creative within that storytelling realm can really help make climate conversations accessible.
What are the most important principles to take into account when you're dealing with people from different cultures or different walks of life, social situations, if you're the person who's in charge of the communication aspect?
That's a great question. I would offer a couple of things. I think one of the most important pieces to be mindful of is we always want to honor different ways of knowing. So if my climate knowledge comes from academia, that's great. I understand the data, I understand the science, I understand the impacts from an academic perspective. But that's also not the only way of knowing. When we're working with different communities, perhaps their way of knowing is through their lived experience, through the changes they've observed. So humility becomes a really important trait when we work with anyone, really, whether they're the same culture from us or a different culture, a different worldview. Humility in how we learn. So it's lived experiences, it's academic knowledge, it's loved experiences. So all of those can come together in creative ways. So that would be one principle. The other one that I hold quite dearly to me is how do we bring people together in ways that are trauma-informed and trauma-aware? So when there is a history of trauma in any community, in any individual, we want to be mindful that when we're bringing people together, that we're not re-traumatizing them. So doing things in a way that supports their well-being. So if we're going to be asking them difficult questions about the land, the livelihood they lost, perhaps family members they lost because of a climate-related disaster, you can't just go in, ask the questions, and leave. You want to be able to make sure that there's appropriate mental health and other supports that are available for community members to engage in that process in a meaningful way and in a way that doesn't leave them more harmed than before you got there. So those would be a couple of things that would stand out.
I have two follow-up questions, one for each principle.
Love it.
So
Absolutely.
for the latter one, you mentioned the presence of a mental health professional. Is it standard practice in the areas where you work? Because I'm imagining someone needs to hire this person. Is it the government that has launched a consultation? Is it the company that wants to set up a project?
Great question. And I wish it were easy to answer, but I'll give you a few thoughts on it. So the first thought is when I suggest that there needs to be mental health supports, it doesn't necessarily need to be a certain kind of mental health professional. It's clinical psychologist, or they might say that we have our medicine people, we have our drum keepers, we have our healers who should be a part of this process. So what you're doing there is you're co-creating that wellness support collaboratively with community members so that everyone going into that process is better informed about what that might entail. Is it standard? I wish it were, and it's not usually the case. However, as professionals, I think we hold that responsibility to always push the boundaries of doing things in a good way. And it's something that we hold very dearly at Narratives. We make mistakes, but we're always learning to do things better. So I would love to see it happen more across the work that we do.
Absolutely. I think many jobs need more mental health support in general, and yeah, this is part of it. And referring to the first principle, you mentioned some people derive their knowledge from academia. And when it comes to sustainability, I mean, for me personally, it's the science, right? The scientists agree on something like global warming. A lot of people don't trust science. Is it something that you've encountered? How do you deal with that type of statement? Because I don't know how else to say the world is warming. You know, we tried remembering our summers when we were kids. We tried talking about the science. What do we do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's so much in that question, Giulia. I'll say I think there's a few thoughts there. Scientists are not the best communicators, and I think that is an important thing for scientists to accept. Just because someone is a scientist doesn't automatically make them a good student of human behavior or human psychology or communication, right? So there's that. I think as scientists, we need a little bit more humility. And my background is an environmental scientist. So I say that, even
To
for
yourself
myself,
as well.
to myself. So let's not assume we're the best communicators. The second piece is I think there's a lot that science can do to better communicate. And I always talk about this idea of making science more artsy. And what I really mean by that is paying attention to how your audience actually understands certain things. How many members in your family actually read a peer-reviewed academic journal about climate change? 1, 2, maybe 5 out of like 100 people. So that's your audience. Your audience is the other 95% of people who are not reading those journals. How do we communicate with those folks? How do we create content that is more accessible to them? So that would be an important thing to think about is no one likes to receive content that makes them feel dumb or that makes them feel intimidated. And that applies to all of us, including scientists. So how do we make knowledge more accessible would be the one question. And at the end of the day, not everybody is going to agree with us. So where we can invest in is building more capacity in our communities to have difficult conversations, to have disagreements. So if someone says global warming is true and the other person says, no, it's not, that shouldn't be the end of the conversation. That should be the beginning of, oh, looks like we don't agree here. Let's unpack it together. So building that capacity can help us, have more conversations in a less emotionally charged way.
It sounds the opposite, basically, of the echo chambers and social media. And how can we create that type of space? I mean, it just everyone in their everyday life. Because obviously here we're talking about mediated consultations. This is a trick question, I suppose.
Yeah, I see
You know,
that.
how can we... I didn't plan it. I'm sorry. It just came out
I love it.
naturally.
I
I
love
just
it.
want to create this in my life. How do I create the space for this type of conversation?
Can happen. I would say identify. Okay, so here's a test. Identify 5 people in your life who your views just don't match on a certain topic. And then figure out as an exercise, the topic that you do want to talk about is that difficult topic. How could you have the conversation in a manner that creates more curiosity, both for you and for them? And I would say, and this is a very tricky thing for scientists to accept, go in assuming not that they are wrong, go in assuming that you might be wrong. How would you change the conversation if you went in? You would exercise more curiosity. You would try to understand why they don't trust science. What are some examples of where science has lost their trust? So if you thought about it that way, you would be forced as a scientist to ask, why don't they believe in science? And maybe that's where the real answer is. And that's how you can have those conversations then.
Fascinating. I've got homework to do. I will leave this
Perfect. I love it.
conversation thinking about it. And this is also this is about nuance, the cultural nuance. Why do we need to always maintain this? Why do we need to champion cultural nuance when we talk about global climate conversations? I mean, COP 30 in Brazil is coming up this year. Very, very clear example of loads and loads of cultures coming together and discussing difficult topics. How do we champion these cultural nuances in this type of conversation? I mean, it's also quite clear that it is the global north that is dominating these conversations, and it ends up being the world does what a certain amount of countries want to do. So I'll just stop talking. This is my question. It's a very long-winded question about cultural nuance.
Yeah. I think, thank you, Giulia. There's so many thoughts that come up for me when I think about cultural nuances in a global sense. One of the key challenges that I see when we talk about cultural nuances is this inherent superiority of worldview in a handful of nations who control the agenda. And that is a tricky, prickly conversation to have. Till we continue to prioritize and respect more a Eurocentric approach to understanding the world, we will continue to run into this issue. Because if the impacts of climate change are being exacerbated by the global north, yet the impacts are being experienced far more by the global south, yet it's the global north whose knowledge systems are preferred, who are setting the agendas, who are leading the conversations, facilitating, mediating, all of those things. We've got a fundamental power imbalance in how we're even having the conversations. What would it look like if we actually let the global south lead the conversation? What would the nature of that conversation be? How would it shift? What would the outcomes then look like? What would be the worldviews, the questions that would become far more important than the questions that we're currently asking? So fundamental shifts in our thinking would be important if we really want to get into a culturally sensitive, culture-centered conversation on sustainability.
Can you think of an example of, I don't know if it's a summit or an event or a consultation where you felt that could be a good example of championing cultural differences?
Yeah, there's this one, I talk about this initiative a little bit because I think it's a great sort of nuanced way to have that conversation. So a few years ago, we were involved it was a highway infrastructure project in Canada in Treaty 3 territory. For 20 years, the provincial government had been trying to expand this highway. And for 20 years, it was being rejected, completely blocked by the Indigenous communities in the area. And the reason was because they were not being even acknowledged that they existed in that region. And what the communities did was they came together for four communities, and they signed a unity agreement. And they said, we are going to negotiate our interests as a collective, and while also honoring our individual interests. And they dictated how that environmental assessment process was going to happen. So typically your environmental assessments in any jurisdiction are led by local laws. Those are typically Eurocentric laws. Here's the assessment, here's what you include, yada, 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 yada. The nation said, that's all good, thank you very much. But we have had laws that have existed well before any of these colonial laws were established. So we're going to do the assessment based on our laws, and we'll include scientific information as we see fit. So they completely flipped how that assessment was done. So where your typical environmental assessment would include, all these different mammals and birds and bees and everything else that's being impacted, they switched it to how they would consider the changes on the land. They went out and spoke to the elders. They went out and spoke to community members. They spent time on the land. There were ceremonies involved. It was doing things in a good way. Long story short, they built what's now called a harmonized impact assessment process. It's received multiple awards around the world as a process that truly flipped the power dynamic and took it from sort of the colonial powers into the hands of the nations. So that would be one example where every step of the way, it was very deliberate that the agenda for the conversation, what would be talked about, how people would meet and engage and negotiate, was led by the communities themselves based on their worldview. And it worked because it was a very deliberately harmonized process. It wasn't their process that they set up was not exclusionary. They found ways to bring in the science in manners that actually worked really well together, as opposed to completely disregarding it. So that would be one example that I would offer. And there's so many others. We just need to sort of amplify those examples so people can see that there's definitely a way.
It sounds amazing because it just feels there isn't one way to do things. It's not a one size fits all. And, it's a very overused term in sustainability, but it's true. Another question that I had was about what advice you have for businesses that find themselves in these situations. They're working in climate. There are different communities, different cultures to deal with. What should they bear in mind?
I could write a book on this topic. I love it.
Your next book.
My next book, I would say a few things. The first one is to really leverage people that they have who can advise them. And what I mean by that is if I'm working with a community that is, say, a Cree community in Canada, if I have members on my team who are Cree, I should be looking at them for some advice on what I could be doing differently, not putting the entire pressure of representing a culture, a way of being, a way of knowing on them, but I could empower them, hold space for them, give them space to share their wisdom with me. One of the mistakes businesses often make is, even if they have a diverse team in-house, they like to bring in external experts to advise them on issues that may actually have some insight internally. So that would be one. The second one would be honestly establishing what sustainability means to them as a business. So we cannot work in a good way with communities, with other organizations, unless we're working in a good way with our own people. So how committed are we as leaders to sustainability? How committed are we as leaders to honoring other ways of knowing, other ways of learning? So taking a hard look at our own systems can be a really important step. And third, small steps go a long way. I think, we can feel really overwhelmed about so many different things. Sometimes it's the small changes that can go a long way to bring about big change. So those would be some of the pieces, in addition to, of course, like honoring different ways of knowing that I previously talked about.
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in once again. I'm sure you will have a lot of food for thought after this episode. We also are on LinkedIn, Instagram, and TikTok, and we have a newsletter as well. Everything will be linked in the show notes. And for now, see you next week.